welcome you all here today for taking time out of your day. And it gives me particular pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Victor Shi, who's not only an associate professor at UCSD, and his full title is here, but also an alumnus of GW. And in fact, the first semester I was teaching here, he was in my class, which gives you some idea how old he is. But he came out this past summer with this wonderful book on coalitions of the weak that explains why it is that Chinese leaders pick weak lieutenants as part of their coalition. And as part of that, this talk is based in different elements from the book, both about the Maoist period, the immediate post-Mao period, brings up to Xi Jinping. So if there's some issue about elite politics and succession that he doesn't address in his talk, feel free to do it in the Q&A. Victor, it's all yours.
Yeah, it's always a great pleasure to be here, to be back in my alma mater, and always great to see Bruce and actually also Martin White, the godfather of China, sociological study of China, who was a professor here. I was fortunate enough to overlap with him, and he wasn't here for that long. So, yeah, I mean, definitely GW was and continues to be a powerhouse for China studies and Asian studies. But I was especially fortunate, I think, at that time. We had a confluence of a lot of very great people, and Harry was here, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, all of you are in the right place studying China and Asia. This is a very wonderful place to do so. So as Bruce indicated, I'm going to talk about one aspect of my new book called Coalitions of the Weak, Elite Politics in China from Mao's Stratagem to the Rise of Xi Jinping. So the book covers mainly the Mao period, and I'm going to talk about some of that here today, but also we'll talk about the 1980s and 1990s and the kind of political structure that was put in place in the 1980s and 1990s that created, I don't explain the rise of Xi Jinping, obviously. It was a very complex thing, but it created the kind of structure, if you will, that allowed Xi Jinping to consolidate power once he became the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012. But today what I'm going to do is first introduce the theoretical framework for the book, and then I will talk about this puzzle that has bugged me since I was an undergrad here at GW. And I felt even the Ezra Vogel book, this 1,000-page long tome, never adequately explained adequately. And today I'm going to try to explain why Deng Xiaoping became not a dictator by any means, but certainly the paramount leader of China in the 1980s and into the 1990s, despite the fact that he was purged a couple of times. Actually 3 times. I mean, once in way back in the 30s, but that wasn't done by Mao. Later on, twice by Mao. So I will tell that story, and I welcome any questions. By the way, this book, widely available. If you go to the Cambridge University website and you order from there, there's a 20% discount code. It's capital SHIH 2022. So that's a discount code if you're interested in ordering it. Okay, this clicker. Unless I'm not requesting my phone. Well, anyway, so in general, I already know what the next slide is. There's a puzzle. Well, the next slide is the cover of the book, so I'll skip over that very quickly. I think in my mind, in the late 1970s, a very unlikely group of leaders became part of the ruling coalition in China. First, you had Deng Xiaoping, who lost power twice during the Cultural Revolution, but was rehabilitated first by Mao and also by the people who took over China after Mao had died and after the purge of the Gang of Four. So that's a very odd outcome if you think about it, because, it's like, oh, well, Mao died, and then, obviously the leaders of China didn't want this kind of radical cultural revolution vision anymore. They purged the Gang of Four. But then, so obviously they kind of disagree with Mao in some fundamental way. But both Mao and Mao's successors after the purge of Gang of Four agreed that they needed to bring back Deng Xiaoping. Why was that the case, right? Then Ye Jianying was another very powerful figure, was nominally in charge of Central Military Commission through much of the second half of the 1970s into the early 1980s, until his death, really. He was a major beneficiary of the Cultural Revolution and only had a very weak faction from the 1930s. So his problem was that he never led troops since the late 1920s. So I think in the late 1920s he led his own troops, but subsequently when the military leaders in China were forming large factions based on the base areas that they commanded during the 1930s and 1940s, Ye Jianying did not have a base area of his own. He was in the general staff of the entire Red Army, so he was making military plans at a very high level. He didn't lead any troops in the field. He didn't start his own field army. But nonetheless, he was in extremely high level and powerful positions through the 1970s into the 1980s until the day he died, really, in the mid-1980s. So why was he able to maintain so much clout in the PLA despite the fact that he never had his own faction within the PLA? Then finally, Li Xiannian. This is the big puzzle and really is the main topic of the book. Li Xiannian, if you look at his file, his personnel file in the archives of the Chinese Communist Party, not that I've done that, but I have read from people who have looked at his file in the Central Committee archive, it literally said Li Xiannian is a counter-revolutionary splitist. And the reason is because he did split the party. He took part in a movement to split the Chinese Communist Party in the middle of the Long March, when the Chinese Communist Party was under the most intense pressure from the KMT on the edge of extinction. He and especially this guy Zhang Guotao, that I'm going to talk a lot more about, split the Long March column into two different parts, one going north toward Yan'an, the other going south to Sichuan province. So he betrayed, in a sense, Zhang Guotao's people betrayed the party when the party was at its weakest. And that's, objectively speaking, that is a heinous crime against the movement that you pledge your allegiance to. And as a result, for people in this group of splittists, that remained a very bad black mark on their records for the rest of their lives. But what's interesting about Li Xiannian is that Mao made him vice premier of China. He became the longest-serving vice premier of China in the history of the People's Republic of China. So he served as vice premier, I think, from sometime in the 1950s all the way until the mid-80s. So, basically a 30-year span. At the same time, being a counter-revolutionary splittist. Explain that one to me. Right? And basically the whole book came about because I found out this fact. I'm like, what the heck is happening here? This guy is a counter-revolution. I thought the Cultural Revolution was all about purging counter-revolutionaries from the party, and here you had a group of bona fide counter-revolutionaries, because it says so on their files, they're counter-revolutionaries, getting promoted, and I'll show you evidence of that, and taking on an enormous amount of power, especially in the military. Even if you were going to hire a bunch of counter-revolutionaries, would you really hire them in the military? You would, whatever, send them to some, okay, I'm not going to say Xinjiang, but, some outlying provinces to work in those places. But no, they were placed in the most powerful positions, not just in the Mao period, but also in the 1980s. And it's like, why do we need these counter-revolutionaries to be in power in the Mao period and also in the Deng period? So I hope to explain that in the talk. So I think to understand that, you need to go back to how Mao hung on to power in the 1970s. So very quick literature review. There's in political science literature, in recent years there's been a heavy focus on one-party dictatorships. They're supposedly the most robust. Statistically they last longer than military dictatorships or monarchies. But all is not well within them. Historically, Stalin purged most of his comrades from the revolutionary period. Mao had the Cultural Revolution, which saw the purge of not most, but like the vast majority of the people who fought in the revolution with him, including Lin Biao, who's one of his most loyal followers, etc. The Soviet Union obviously collapsed after kind of a failed coup. And then, more recently in 2012, there were all these rumors that there was an attempted coup in China that was going to be launched by Zhou Yongkang. It failed. It led to the purge of Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang. So even though kind of one-party dictatorships, relatively speaking, you can say, oh, they're more stable, they're not problem-free. There are a lot of, very nasty and surprising internal politics to these one-party regimes. And basically, and also the other thing is that despite this whole meritocracy literature in political science, about how, in countries like China, they promote the best and brightest, through these different mechanisms. But that's not true, right? So if China was such a great meritocracy, why did the anti-corruption campaign that Xi Jinping initiated in 2012, why did it lead to the arrest of thousands of officials in China? So obviously the promotion mechanism is such that it does select for some people who are very corrupt. It selects for some people who are perhaps administratively not especially strong. And also, I would argue, it selects for people with very weak political networks, either because they're very inexperienced or because they have this very checkered history, which could be corruption, but also it could be things like counter-revolutionary crimes. So there is this incentives built into a lot of single-party dictatorships. The fundamental problem here is that authoritarian politics is fundamentally uncertain. So, people think of it as like, well, what's so uncertain about authoritarian politics? You have one leader, and then, everyone's supposed to obey this one leader. It's simple, right? So it should be a very certain environment. But actually, authoritarian politics is missing. It doesn't provide certain information that is readily available in democracies. For one thing, you don't know who your enemies are. So in the US, you know all too well who your enemies are. Like people even imagine, who their enemies are. The Republicans believe the Democrats' enemy. Democrats believe the Republicans are enemies, etc., etc. So that's well known. In one-party dictatorships, everyone's in the same party. They're all supposed to be on the same side, but everyone knows that that's not the case. You have enemies, and so you're always like guessing who your enemies are. The other thing that, the other information that's readily available in democracies is that you know how powerful your enemies are relative to yourself, because you can do opinion pollings, you can look at the institutional settings. It's like, oh, well, because Pennsylvania is going to be a swing state, the latest polling shows that more people are going to vote for the Democrat as opposed to Republicans. You automatically know that Democrats have an upper hand, on the eve of an election, let's say, right? But in authoritarian dictatorship, you don't know at least you don't know to the degree of certainty who is more powerful than another politician. You roughly know, but you really don't know with a fine-grained certainty. And that leads to a lot of preemptive action, right? So it's like, oh, well, I'm not sure if this person is more powerful than me. I better get rid of this person before he or she is definitely more powerful than me. And this kind of preemptive purges, which Mao did, of course, and Stalin especially did in great abundance, is what leads to a lot of turmoil in one-party dictatorships. So then, traditionally, the way to deal with this kind of uncertainty is factionalism. Right? So you have a bunch of people with a past history of loyal service to the dictator. You promote these people, and of course, Xi Jinping is doing that a lot today. And then they are supposed to support you. The problem with even this approach is that you can have someone like Lin Biao, who historically was very loyal to Mao, but then at the end of the day, Mao was very suspicious of him because his faction was getting so powerful and a bit unruly, and so in the end, Mao had to preemptively try to purge him, and then Lin Biao's son preemptively tried to assassinate Mao, and so on and so forth. So it led to some very unstable politics. So even factionalism has its limit, basically. The mechanism that I propose is that the only sure way to overcome this information deficit is you have to systematically replace potentially powerful senior leaders with very weak senior leaders. And it has to be like extremely weak, right? So there has to be some major flaws with these people such that they can never challenge your power. Because that will overcome the information deficit, right? So if you appoint, so let's say you're the leader of China, and you're like, okay, I don't know, like this person used to be a general, this person used to be in charge of a certain province. They're kind of powerful. I don't know, when they're going to be powerful enough to challenge my power. Let me go down to the provinces, randomly pick some worker and appoint that person to be the vice chairman of the party. And surely, because this person was just an ordinary worker yesterday, suddenly he's in the Politburo. There's no way this person can possibly challenge my power. Mao did that, and his name was Wang Hongwen. So Wang Hongwen was an ordinary worker. I mean, he led a Red Guard band, in Shanghai and all that kind of stuff. But that didn't change the fact that he was a worker. 3-4 years later, he became the vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and in line to succeed Chairman Mao. So at the time, people were like, this makes no sense, why? And then later on, it got worse, right? You had like people like Chen Yonggui. Chen Yonggui was a farmer who led a commune, and he did a good job. This is Marty's territory here, these brigades, and I don't know, was it like especially productive or something like that? I don't know, did he come up with work point system that worked the best, that kind of stuff?
It didn't work best, but they claimed it did.
Right, exactly, something. But as far as I can tell, the guy was not literate, like he could not read very well. And he became the vice premier of China in charge of all agricultural policy in China.
Around his head even when he was in Beijing.
Right. Well, you sweat. I mean, that's in this case is kind of political stress that leads to the sweating, not toiling. You have this Wei Xian, who was this textile worker, who became vice premier of China in charge of industrial policy. So you have people like that. And to me, so it was kind of puzzling, when I first learned these facts, but to me now it makes total sense because these are the kinds of people who can never ever challenge your power as the dictator of China. And so these are the kinds of people that you do want to promote to a very senior level. So yeah, basically you overcome this information deficit. You also lessen the probability that a rival coalition sufficiently powerful can overthrow the incumbent. So that's basically the main argument of the book, is that this is a very coherent strategy of replacing powerful colleagues with very weak colleagues. So who do I mean by weak? Inexperienced, people with no political networks, very little information. They're going to be very obedient to the dictator at first because they have no network, they can't stand on their own 2 feet, they don't know how the elite political game works, they don't know when they can cheat on the supreme leader. So they're going to try to follow the orders of the supreme leader as much as possible. So no factions. And then, the fact that they have no factions these are very well-known facts. I mean, and it's not easily changeable within a short period of time. I mean, you do have, over time, some of these initially very weak figures, people like Wen Jiabao. So Wen Jiabao, directly promoted from provinces into Zhongban, to the Central Administrative Office, initially extremely weak, but after being in Beijing for 20 years, and yes, he built up a faction, but it took him 20 years to do it. For the first 10 years in office, he was still a very weak figure. So it takes time to build up your networks. But today I'm going to focus on the other kind of weak officials with checkered history. Basically, tainted individuals are defined as actors whose rehabilitation within a given set of institutions requires some kind of cost and effort. And basically in any kind of institutions, you have the people who are basically valued, and then you have less valued members of the community. And sometimes even, a set of norms embedded in institutions will condemn a subset of people in that organization to a kind of a bad status. Of course, the biggest example of that in the United States is institutional racism. But within the Chinese Communist Party, you had the good categories, model workers, people, revolutionary martyrs, people who died for the revolution. And of course, people who were serving in the government, serving in the People's Liberation Army. But you definitely had the bad categories embedded in the Chinese Communist Party's norms. You had capitalists, obviously very bad, at least back in the 1950s, and maybe today also, if we can talk about that. Capitalists, but then within the party, the worst kind of people you can be are counter-revolutionaries. People who try to undermine the revolution, and especially counter-revolutionary splitists, right? So you're trying to undermine the revolution by trying to split the party. That really is the worst possible thing that you can be, and to basically change the norms. So at the end of the day, it's all constructed, it's all norms. You will have to spend a lot of effort and time to try to change it. I was like, counter-revolutionaries are not so bad after all. It's not going to be a free thing. You really have to change the narrative to a considerable extent. You have to invest a lot of time and energy to it. So that's what I mean by this statement. It's not a cost-free exercise. Of course, it's all constructed, but it's not easily changeable at the same time. So, some investment in social discourse in the past has rendered a subset of individuals to be highly undesirable, and, so it's very hard to change that. And even if a rival coalition were to emerge, they're less likely, it doesn't mean that they completely won't, but they're less likely to associate themselves with these tainted actors, because it's like, oh, well, these are the bad people. If we make an alliance with them, then people are going to think that we're bad, and that doesn't serve our cause. But I think, to me, the more I think about this issue, the more I think this last mechanism matters the most, which is that if you are in a tainted group within a set of institutions, you think to yourself, okay, do I join a rebellion against the incumbent dictator, or do I just support the incumbent? Your return, which is like how much you're going to get once you successfully join a rebellion, is very limited, because even after you join a rebellion and you're successful, you're still tainted, and so your return for doing that is very limited. And given that a rebellion is very risky, why would you take the risk? Right? You would just back the incumbent. And because the dictator knows this, the dictator also will use these tainted individuals because they're reliable. Some of them have a lot of experience, they have decent network sizes, so they can actually get some stuff done, but at the same time, they have low incentives to try to overthrow the incumbent. Lower incentives, but not no incentives, as I'll talk about. Okay, so that's the theoretical framework of the book, and so I'm going to so I'll show you a couple of graphs to show the larger kind of empirical evidence that I bring to bear. So if you can look at weak figures the way that I've defined it, either with very small networks, so these are Politburo members with ties to less than 10% of the Central Committee. Some of you know my work better, I do this obsessively. I calculate this like factional ties and all this kind of stuff. But basically the share of these small networked elite at the 8th Party Congress was 0. Actually, at the 8th Party Congress, every Politburo member in the 8th Party Congress had a network that was at least 10% of the Central Committee. That share rose over time, ultimately to 36% by the time of the 10th Party Congress. And then the second category, these Fourth Front Army veterans that I'm going to talk about in detail shortly, they are the checkered one. They existed back in the 8th Party Congress in 1956, 8% of them, but then their share rose to 20% during the Cultural Revolution. And if you add those two groups together, you get to over half of the Politburo being these pretty weak figures. And of course, if you don't count Mao, so this actually counts Mao, because Mao's Politburo member, obviously, then the ratio is even higher, because there aren't that many people in the Politburo. One result of Coalition of the Weak is it's not so people often talk about this loyalty and competence trade-off. So I wouldn't say that weak officials are necessarily incompetent. Some of them are quite competent, they know a lot, especially in the 1980s. So the book talks about politics in the 1980s. Many of them have engineering degrees, they're very smart. They just have a small network. They can't get a lot of things done. And when you move politics into this total coalition of the weak, the institutions degenerate. So you see this during the late Mao period, the number of formal party meetings, state council meetings, and National People's Congress meetings just kind of collapsed. So that even in some years, it was 0. So there were just no meetings of any kind, for a couple of years, not all throughout the Cultural Revolution period, but so you have this, right before Mao died, a few years before Mao died, politics degenerated to, Mao was very sick, he would whisper something, there was one person who could understand what he was whispering, his nephew, nephew would be like, okay, I think I understand what he's saying. He would go to the Politburo and say, Chairman Mao just said this, do it. And then everyone would just do it. I mean, if you think about it, that's completely insane. It's like, why didn't the rest of the elite just, overthrow Mao? Basically, it's like, what's happening here? He's sick, and this guy claims that he knows what Mao is saying, and he's telling us what to do. It's like, give me an extra large ice cream. That's what Mao said. It's like, why should I believe you? So obviously, once Deng took over, the institutions started working again. So let me tell the story of Zhang Guotao and the Fourth Front Army. So Zhang Guotao, as some of you know, was a giant in the Chinese Communist Party. He's the only CCP leader who had met Lenin, Stalin, and Bukharin, and lived in the Soviet Union for a period of time. I don't think it was years, it was definitely months. And he met all three leaders, was well respected by the Comintern, even more so than Chairman Mao, right? So I think Zhang Guotao was placed in the category of Zhou Enlai, a very reliable internationalist cadre that the Comintern can back and support within the Chinese Communist Party, had a lot of promises. And indeed, when he came back to China, they immediately assigned him to be in charge of a base area. So this was right after 1927, right after the KMT betrayal. Fortunately, Mao and others had these rural base areas, so the communist movement lived on. Mao went to Jiangxi, so Jinggangshan and then Jiangxi Soviet, started all this, base area. And Zhang Guotao went slightly north to Eyuan, so it's the border area between Anhui, Henan, and Anhui, Henan, what's the third one? Eyuan. Hubei, exactly, Hubei, that's a big one, yeah. Big one, yeah, so these are things like, we're gonna spend 10 years writing this book, copy, no, Hubei, of course, Hubei. He's having a blank period here. And it was very successful. Actually, the Yuan base area was just as successful as Jiangxi Soviet. It grew, they raised, initially they raised slightly less troops than Mao did, but Mao kind of cheated. There was this like very intensive drive for having soldiers. So at the beginning of the Long March, Mao had 100,000 troops, supposedly, but half of them were recruited like within a month before the Long March. Yuan raised 60,000 troops toward the end. When the KMT struck the base areas in 1935, they attacked both the Jiangxi Soviet and also this Yuan base area. Of course, we know the story of the Long March. Mao had to embark on the Long March west to Guizhou province and then went north. For these guys, for the Fourth Front Army, so Mao's army was the First Front Army, Zhang Guotao's was the Fourth Front Army. They went west. So when under KMT pressure, they went west to western Sichuan, where they set up another base area for a while in late 1934, early 1935. But then eventually Mao's Long March column turned north, actually started marching north, also into western Sichuan. And Zhang Guotao heard about this. He's like, this is great. The Red Army is going to reunite. It's wonderful news for the Chinese Communist Party. So he took his troops of 60,000 troops and moved west to join with Chairman Mao. And before the meeting, Zhang Guotao thought that Mao would still have this huge army of 100,000, because that was the rumor. But what Zhang Guotao saw instead was barely 10,000 troops, hungry, very skinny, very sick, because they had been on this very long march, very arduous, under constant attack by the KMT, whereas Zhang Guotao had 20, 30,000 troops. So then he's like, wait a minute, I'm like several times bigger than you. Why do I have to listen to you? Right, because Mao was like, it wasn't just Mao, it was like Mao, Zhou Enlai, Bo Hu, and Otto Braun, this German Comintern advisor. It was like, we're in charge, because we're the Central Committee. But Zhang Guotao was like, well, wait a minute, I have more troops. Well, why should I listen to you? Right? So, indeed, he was kind of a splittus. I think it wasn't quite 10 times, but it was like 8 times more than Mao's troops. So then they had this is Mao Gong, right? The Mao Gong Hui Shi. They had very intense debate about what to do with the combined Red Army. Chairman Mao wanted to move north to Yan'an. Zhang Guotao wanted to go back to his base area in western Sichuan because he's like, well, there's a political vacuum in western Sichuan. We could stay there. There's a lot of revenue because it was an opium, producing area. We can get a lot of money, recruit a lot of troops. Everything would be great. But Mao was just like, no, we should go north. So there was a huge debate. They ultimately, the Central Committee, which was really with Mao, they voted to go north. So that's why the troops started to go north along 2 columns. So one on the left side of the grassland. This is the famous grassland, right before Yan'an. All these long marchers died in the grassland. What's interesting was that they actually split up the Fourth Front Army and the First Front Army. So some of the Fourth Front Army would march with the First Front Army, and some in the First Front Army would march with the Fourth Front Army. The main First Front Army marchers with Chairman Mao in the middle of the grassland just decided to wake up really early one morning and just continue marching north. Because they were still having this debate about whether going north or south, and went back and forth even during this march toward Yan'an. And then the Fourth Front Army contingent, when they woke up, they're like, "Oh my God, everyone's gone. What do we do?" And it included people like Xu Xiangqian and Li Xianan, future high-level officials in China. They then decided, like, oh well, I guess if they're gone. And in the meantime, the main Fourth Front Army column had decided to just turn around to go south. So then all the Fourth Front Army contingents, once Mao's troops, left them behind to go north, they decided that, I guess that's what's happening. We're just going to split up. You do your thing. So this is very fashionable these days. It's like, yeah, you just do your thing, whatever. I'll just do my thing. That's totally okay. But in the Chinese Communist Party, that's like not okay. Basically, like you just have to do what the Central Committee decides to do. But Zhang Guotao ignored that, marched south. People in his army ignored that. They marched south. On top of that, later on, Chairman Mao made this accusation. So later on, Chairman Mao said, the reason why we left the Fourth Front Army behind to go north was because there was a secret telegram from Zhang Guotao to Xu Xiangqian and Cheng Changhao, so two senior commanders of the Fourth Front Army that was marching with Chairman Mao, ordering them to massacre senior officers of the First Front Army. Because we didn't want to be massacred, nor did we want to start a civil war with them, we just left them behind, right? And the one witness to this supposed telegram was Ye Jianying. So the man who would be General Staff, Chief of General Staff of the PLA for decades to, in the future, was the one person who said, yes, I read the telegram. The telegram indeed ordered the Fourth Front Army to liquidate the Central Committee. And he insisted on that fact until he died, even though there's not a shred of historical evidence for that. But since that point, Chairman Mao would always say that, the Fourth Front Army, they're very guilty. If you want a witness for that, just talk to Ye Jianying. He's the witness. And so he's very crucial politically because the Fourth Front Army is politically very vulnerable. They objectively split the party, that's true. But there's also this accusation that they tried to liquidate the Central Committee, and the only witness to that was Ye Jianying. So this secret telegram to Chen Changhao and Xu Xiangqian, and then Ye Jianying intercepted the telegram, read it, ran to Chairman Mao, said, Chairman, guess what I just saw? Here's the telegram. Mao was like, oh my God, we better leave. So that's a story. I think it's completely false. I mean, interestingly, this debate about the telegram continued into after 2010. I mean, you have party historians that are still debating this topic. Then what happened was the fortune of history or the randomness of history intervened. When Mao went north, he was received very well by Zhang Shiliang, the local warlord. All the military pressure from the KMT stopped. There were also communists in northwestern China to welcome them, including Xi Jinping's father, Xi Dongxun was there. Whereas for Zhang Guotao, they went back down to Sichuan, ran right into an enormous KMT force, which began to annihilate them. So they had to turn back around to go north, back to Yan'an. So there are some, that's why when you read about these long marchers, some of them went through the grassland 3 times, because they went north, then they went south, and then they had to go back up north through the grassland again. That was the reason. And so diminished Fourth Front Army was still bigger than the First Front Army. And so what Mao did was to send them west to Xinjiang, supposedly, to pick up weapons from the Soviet Union. But then in the Gansu corridor, Mao ordered them to stop, to start a base area. There were a lot of these kind of Muslim warlords in the area, so of course they started to attack the Red Army column because it was like, what the hell are you doing in our territory? And basically 95% of half of the Fourth Front Army was massacred. Only a couple hundred people survived, including Li Xiannian, who was the leader of the survivors of the death march into the Gansu corridor, later on become the longest serving vice premier of China. And when they got to Xinjiang, some of them were shot as Trotskyite, so it was this poor guy. And then what made it worse was Zhang Guotao himself defected to the KMT, later on becoming a Canadian citizen, dying in Vancouver. So then, all of the Fourth Front Army people, they were related to counter-revolutionary splitters, a group of people that tried to liquidate the Central Committee, and also followers of a defector. You couldn't get worse. Actually, then it got even worse. So in the interest of time, I'll skip over the details. But in official documents, Zhang Guotao is still called a splittist today. Yet, survivors of Zhang's faction did very well. So if you look at, this is some logit analysis here, controlling for a lot of individual level characteristics. If you were in the 8th Party Congress Central Committee, your chance of getting purged if you were from the First Front Army was 43%. If you're from the Second Front Army, 39%. But if you were from the Fourth Front Army, you got into the Central Committee at the 8th Party Congress, your chance of getting purged before the 9th Party Congress was only 8%. So your chance of getting purged was a lot lower, even though they were actually counter-revolutionaries. This is the astonishing thing, and they had a much lower odds of getting purged. If you weren't in the Central Committee, so the second column of numbers, basically, if you weren't in the Central Committee already, the disparity is not as large, but still a lower odds of getting purged. The chance of getting promotion, on the other hand, was way higher for these Fourth Front Army veterans. 50% chance of getting promotion if you were already in the Central Committee. 31% chance of getting promoted if you weren't in the Central Committee. So not a huge difference, but still higher. Right. So this is statistical result. Okay, so where does Deng Xiaoping come into play? So this is the leaders of all the major military units after the Lin Biao incident, so in 1972. So you have secretaries, commanders, political commissar of all the major departments, and also all the military regions. So this is really hard to read, so I'll just summarize. Basically, there were 14 Fourth Front Army veterans who were leading these most powerful positions in the military. So over half of the powerful positions in the military were led by Fourth Front Army veterans. So that in itself is a very astonishing fact, given that they're all counter-revolutionaries. The bolded people were the ones who also were commanded by Deng Xiaoping. So basically what happened was that after the death march in Gansu, the Fourth Front Army all just went back to Yan'an. They underwent a lot of criticism. Then Zhang Guotao defected. But then the anti-Japanese war was going on. This is like 1937. So the CCP had to fight the Japanese or to start guerrilla-based areas behind Japanese lines. And so Chairman Mao put the majority of the surviving Fourth Front Army under the command of Deng Xiaoping. And so Deng Xiaoping commanded exactly half actually, so 7 out of 14 of the Fourth Front Army veterans who were in power in 1972. So this is why, after the Lin Biao incident, Mao basically was like, oh my God, now the military is completely dominated by the Fourth Front Army, even though they're politically vulnerable. I don't trust them 100%. I need someone who can divide their loyalty. And Deng Xiaoping was the perfect person, because Deng Xiaoping wasn't from the Fourth Front Army. He's from another faction that was, basically eradicated in the early 1930s by the KMT. But at the same time, he commanded Fourth Front Army veterans through the anti-Japanese war and through the Chinese Civil War. A lot of them owed their rehabilitated careers to Deng Xiaoping, right? So because a lot of Fourth Front Army veterans, even though they basically got a demotion of like 3 or 4 levels after the defection of Zhang Guotao, but because they were fighting constantly against the Japanese and against the KMT, over time they got promoted again, and Deng Xiaoping was the guy who promoted them back into these senior level positions. Including Xu Xiangqian and Xu Shiyou, and especially this guy Chen Xilian. So Chen Xilian was the most powerful military figure in the PLA after the Lin Biao incident. He became head of PLA chief of staff, basically controlled the military at the time of Mao's death, and Chen Xilian's career was revived by Deng Xiaoping. And so this is why Mao knew this, and this is why Mao rehabilitated Deng Xiaoping to drive a wedge within the Fourth Front Army bloc. And even after Mao died, the Fourth Front Army was still very dominant in the PLA. So even the people who survived Mao and survived the Gang of Four, including Hua Guofeng, Ye Jianying, Chen Yun. So these were the people who were in the Politburo after the purge of Gang of Four, Chen Yun, Li Xiannian. They decided, okay, probably not Li Xiannian, but like everyone else, Li Xiannian would rather not have this divided loyalty, would rather to have the Fourth Front Army just listen to him. But everyone else, they wanted Deng Xiaoping back in order to divide the loyalty of the Fourth Front Army, which was still extremely powerful in the PLA through the 1970s into the 1980s. So that's the basic story. Deng can divide the loyalty of the Fourth Front Army. That is the key. This is why him and not anyone else had to be put in charge of the CMC. Because if you think about just by military qualifications, there were a lot of survivors of the Cultural Revolution who could have done it. There were all these people, Niu Yongzhen and Xu Xiangqian himself could have done it. But it had to be done because he both had the military experience and also can divide the loyalty of the Fourth Front Army to make sure that they don't rise up and try to seize power themselves. At the same time, Ye Jianying continues to be an important actor. So for Deng, once he was rehabilitated after the Cultural Revolution, he was like, wait a minute, I also want something to hold over the Fourth Front Army, Ye Jianying, because Ye Jianying is still the only witness to the most heinous crime of the Fourth Front Army, that they tried to liquidate the Central Committee. Right, so that's why he was around. And Li Xiannian, of course, was around because he was the representative of the Fourth Front Army, actually. So that's why Li Xiannian continued to be in power. In the 80s, you basically saw more equal representation between the Fourth Front Army and the other front army. So the odds of getting command or a Central Committee seat is pretty evenly split between veterans of the different front armies. And of course, Deng himself used the same tactic, right? So Deng continued to appoint Fourth Front Army veterans to senior positions. 3 of the 4 ministers of defense in the 1980s until 1993 were Fourth Front Army veterans. The last surviving member of the Long March generation to be in the Politburo Standing Committee, Liu Huaqing, was a Fourth Front Army veteran, actually. And then their children and in-laws continue to be very important. So these are some of the Fourth Front Army veterans. And then these are some of the Fourth Front Army kids today. So you have Xu Xiangqian's son, Xu Xiaoyan, and then Qin Tian, Qin Weijiang. They are children of Qin Jiwei. So Qin Jiwei, Minister of Defense in the 1980s, a Fourth Front Army veterans. Their kids are in, although actually I think Qin Tian just retired this year. And then Liu Yazhou is the son-in-law of Li Xiannian, of course. So this, very torturous history of the Long March, I think holds the key to why Deng Xiaoping became the supreme leader of China in the 1980s, and also why civil-military relation in the CCP is relatively manageable, compared to other authoritarian dictatorships, because generations of leaders in China relied on this tainted faction to control the military. Anyway, thank you for being here today, and I welcome any questions.
I'll start us off. So your question is why did Deng Xiaoping emerge as the leader? I've always wondered why Hua Guofeng went so quiet. I mean, he held the top 3 positions. He had Mao's mandate, and yet he just becomes a footnote within a couple of years. So how was he also part of the coalition of the week that Deng was able to undermine effectively, or was it a different dynamic there?
Yeah, so no, that's a very good question, and I get into this a little bit in the book, although even for me it is a little bit hazy. But basically for Waggle the trick was this, right? Basically, the ideal scenario for him was to get rid of the Gang of Four, of course, but then rely on Ye Jianying. So the problem was that Ye Jianying knew that he could not govern the military alone because the Fourth Front Army veterans, they all hated him because Ye Jianying lied, to get him in trouble. And Hua Guofeng could not have just relied on Ye Jianying to control the Fourth Front Army. So his choice was either he had to rehabilitate Deng Xiaoping and let him sort of take charge of the military, or he would have to completely side with the Fourth Front Army, just be like, I will rehabilitate you. But I think for him there was with the two whateverism, because Mao was the one who condemned the Fourth Front Army, and if he turns around and say that, oh, guess what, Fourth Front Army, you're not guilty of anything anymore, that's going a bit too far. And he didn't want to do the rehabilitation part. Had he been willing to do the rehabilitation of the Fourth Front Army, I think he wouldn't have needed to rehabilitate Deng Xiaoping, and I think he could have been fine. But it clashed too much with the two whateverism. So then they had to, and also the other elites like Ye Jianying and Chen Yun were clamoring for Deng Xiaoping to be rehabilitated. Once Deng is rehabilitated, he then became the only person who could control the military and also had a lot of civilian connections, of course. And then everyone just gravitated toward Deng, and he lost the fight. And he knew he lost, and he just didn't try to fight it. But there was this period, I think, when he was thinking about, saying, well, is there a way that I can avoid the rehabilitation of Deng Xiaoping? And in the end, he just couldn't manage it, basically. Yeah.
I have a question that might force you to move us a little bit more to the present, but using this historical context, I'm curious what the relationship with civil-military relations are like today with the generations of Fourth Front Army children, but also with the restructuring of the military that has taken place under Xi Jinping.
Oh, gosh. Fortunately, I just finished an absent paper on that topic, so I can go on for another hour on this. No, so what we found statistically was this. So in the civilian world, Xi Jinping pursued a very factional strategy of promoting people with whom he had worked in the past. He did not do that in the military. So the Nanjing military region, even though he could point at some people from the Nanjing military region obviously benefited, but it wasn't a pure factional strategy. Instead, for some of the units that were affected by the reform, like GSD, GP, or General GPD, GLD, and the Jinan and Chengdu military regions, some of the senior officers in those units benefited with delayed retirement. So Xi Jinping allowed them to retire later. And also there wasn't this total cleansing of the Xu Caiho faction. I mean, they faced a higher risk of being purged, to be sure, but it wasn't like a huge effect. And so by pursuing this kind of mixed strategy, Xi Jinping avoided a wide-ranging backlash against what he did. Because he basically went to, folks in the affected units and say, okay, look, you're not going to be an absolute loser in this. Some of you will benefit, others of you will not. And basically he was able to divide, again, it's about dividing loyalty and dividing interests in order to obtain control in the military. So I think Xi Jinping, I think he's a very, very smart politician for authoritarian politics. I mean, clearly, he wouldn't be this successful. And yeah, so when we saw the findings, I mean, it's still a bit preliminary because we don't have the entire database, we have 70% of the database coded, et cetera, but it looks that he didn't pursue a straight-out factional strategy, which would have invited resistance from all the other military regions. That's not what happened. So I think that's, as far as we can tell, that's kind of the story. Other questions? Yeah.
So you talk about how you have to invest in the social discourse either to actually make someone change an individual or in turn to rehabilitate them. Because China is such an authoritarian system, are you worried about the image of these individuals in the eyes of the public or in the eyes of the party officials, or who are you actually rehabilitating the image to?
It's really the party elite. And that's not to say that rehabilitating the Fourth Front Army was impossible. All these people got rehabilitated after the Cultural Revolution, but it was some kind of investment, right? So you first have to have some preliminary judgment on a group. So, there was this famous group of like these, I forget, it's like 21 or 26 traitors against the revolution that Mao had condemned them, to this horrible traitor status at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. So there had been this long investigation into, whether the history was true or not. It was deemed that they weren't actually traitors to the party. They did it at the command of the party. Then they had to issue a central document, then had to hold like multiple meetings to convince everyone that these traitors were not guilty of their crimes. So it's an investment to change the narrative. And for the Fourth Front Army, it would have been a much bigger deal because it's just true that they split the party. So then to try to turn that around, would have been very hard to convince the rank and file party members. So we only talk about party members. I think ordinary Chinese don't really care about this kind of stuff. So elite party members, they fought it. Actually, all the First Front Army people, they fought it because they themselves had invested a lot of their own energy into this narrative that the Fourth Front Army, were like these splitters and stuff, because they participated in the criticism sessions against the Fourth Front Army back in the 1930s. So they didn't want that to change either, right? So they fought it. So it would have been a big cost, certainly. And it's the cost that makes it credible and makes their status as tainted individuals very credible. Yeah, anyway, there's another question.
Thank you for your lecture. So if you look at the time frame from the start of the war of 1979 up to today, does the whole strategy of using the children or former members of the Fourth Front Army to kind of like control the military, does what effect does it have on the PLA as like professional fighting force, like positive benefit or negative?
Oh, you mean today? No. So I don't think the children of just the Fourth Front Army are especially used today. They end up, becoming senior just because they're princelings. It's because their parents were in power in the 1980s that they do so well today. So princelings in general, and this is true both in military and also in the civilian side, they do very well at first. So all the way up to prefecture level or division level in military, extremely rapid promotion. But then they run into a lot of resistance, both on the civilian side and also military side. So a lot of princeling, unless they have especially close ties with Xi Jinping, they get to like Zhengjun, army level at best, and that's it. For many of them, very few make it into even vice military region level. A couple makes it into the CMC, because they're seen as too threatening. They have a lot of networks. And so Xi Jinping, and so interestingly, the princeling did the best under Hu Jintao. So Hu Jintao couldn't say no to them. The princeling just rode roughshod over Hu Jintao. They got themselves promoted, very rapidly. Under Xi Jinping, no advantage to the princelings. The only advantage they got was delayed retirement. So they're able to delay their retirement beyond even the legally mandated age, 63, 65. Because I think Xi Jinping finds it useful to have some of these people around as like a bedrock to his support coalition. But neither does he want them to be too powerful, because if they're too powerful, they can challenge his power. So that's why what's the guy, Liu Yuan, right? Liu Yuan, the vice director of General Logistics Department, not that old, compared to other PLA officers at that level. Xi Jinping forced him to retire. Because Liu Yuan, as the son of actually the vice chairman of the party, his father had a higher rank than Xi Jinping's own father. These kinds of things matter for princelings, and so he had to retire. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, sure.
Sorry, not to
Why not?
Choose you guys. But I'm curious what the implications of these coalitions of the weak are for governance of the country, and thinking about how, if Deng was able to come out through this circumstance, and then he instituted all these changes to try and create some kind of principles of institutionalization. How does that then play out?
Yeah, so I don't think, so you're talking about today, right? It's like, I don't think it will, short of some kind of, weird cultural revolution like movement in China, it's not really ever going to be as bad as during the Cultural Revolution, this deinstitutionalization. The last couple years of a dictator's life is always very tricky because they're very sick, and then you have to informalize the policy process. But until you get to that point, basically all the other institutions that you've created in the past, they exist, right? All the ministries, military regions, theater commands, all the stuff, they exist, they can operate, they hum along. But then the incentive for the dictator to place increasingly weak people into these positions get higher over time as they themselves feel that they're under greater threats, they're weaker, etc. But all that means is that the people you place in these positions, they don't make any autonomous decisions. They just say, okay, if you tell them to do A, they'll do A, or at least nominally do A. The implementation is not especially effective because these people have a lot less informal power. They don't dare to exert too much power for fear that that's going to be seen as building up an independent kingdom in a certain set of bureaucracy, which invites purges. So they just don't take a lot of initiative, and there's a lot of stasis, there's a lot of squabbling and debating between people who are in charge of different domains. So you have this kind of late Soviet siloing. So I think that is a very likely outcome for China, going into the second and maybe even third decade of Xi Jinping's rule. Yeah, back up.
And I have a question about, it seems to suggest that there were different kinds of leaders. Some of them are inexperienced. Some others, like the force from army, were more tainted by history.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, do you think the Chinese Communist Party in general adopted different strategies in civilian and military positions? You mentioned in the civilian positions, bring many inexperienced people, but in the military, they seem to be more likely to use those historically tainted but still more capable.
Well, I mean, today there was this experiment. I don't know how that's going. Maybe some of you can tell me of like rotating officers from a different branch to be in charge of like a cross-branch rotations, right? That, of course, is good for anti-corruption and like weakening the power bases of officers and stuff like that. So, you would have like naval officers going to the Air Force and Air Force going to the Army, et cetera, et cetera. That is kind of trying to weaken the power base of these people. But surely that must affect battle effectiveness somehow. But I'm not enough of an expert to comment on this. So you do see some manifestation of this. And then you have like some military academics suddenly being put in charge. But usually they would be political commissars, so they're not in charge of the actual operation, just the political loyalty, if you will. So maybe that's okay. Yeah, I don't know a lot about the military, so I mean, I did write a paper about it. It doesn't make me an expert. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a follow-up question. Are the military officers in charge of the actual warfighting operation? Are they mostly like the enlisted or professional officers who move around the military academy?
Well, no. So the Fourth Front Army, they were commanders. They were not political commissars. So they were in charge of like the command of, especially in the military region. Princelings, you have a mix. Some of them are political commissars, other are commanders. The only thing that tends to be kind of more political commissars are these like cross-branch appointments. They tend to be political commissars. But yeah, no, I mean, there in this town, I'm sure there are plenty of better PLA experts than me. I focus more on the political dimensions. It's kind of interesting. But yes.
So I'm just sort of curious about Deng's motive for doing this, and I mean I think the implication is that this helped him to consolidate his own power, perhaps. But I'm also what does other literature say? People like Ezra Vogel, they've stressed that he's pragmatic. So if this works, we do it. So was any of it this pattern of placement? It just worked, right? And also, of course, Deng himself, as you mentioned, was purged, a couple of times, and his own relationship with Mao was, on and off. So, I mean, he may have had, is it possible that he had some sort of empathy or sympathy for other people who'd, been through this?
Well, yeah, so what Deng did was very interesting. So historically, he was closest to this guy named Chen Xilian. So Chen Xilian was the chief of general staff in the PLA when Mao died. So, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful PLA leader at that time. When Deng was rehabilitated, he actually forced Chen Xilian into retirement. So he didn't, even though this guy was factionally sort of close to him, he didn't want a very powerful Fourth Front Army leader to hold such high-level positions. What then he did was some of the lower-level people that Deng knew, like Qin Jiwei and Hong Xuezhi, they were then promoted to higher-level positions. And then on top of that, so this is what kind of this shows, is that he rehabilitated officers from the First Front Army and also the Second Front Army to balance against the Fourth Front Army. So he didn't want any of the military factions to become too powerful. So that's very pragmatic, but that also follows Chairman Mao's playbook, basically. So this is kind of what Chairman Mao tried to do prior to the Lin Biao incident. So prior to the Lin Biao incident, Lin Biao obviously was getting strong, but Chairman Mao also promoted these counter-revolutionary splitters to balance against Lin Biao. Even though historically, of course, Lin Biao was very loyal to Mao, Deng Xiaoping did the same thing, basically. Yeah. Oh, yes, Mark.
Isn't there a certain irony about Mao promoting Deng? And you could say, well, it's because it came in history, he'd been in the Cultural Revolution, he was the second most important capitalist ruler and all of that, but in the end, of course, it was Deng Xiaoping, after Mao, who basically reversed huge amounts of what Mao was trying to do. So it became extraordinarily powerful. So he may have been compromised in a certain sense, but he ended up being very powerful, undermining much of what Mao wanted him to do. And Mao's bet on Guo Feng instead of Deng Xiaoping failed in the end.
Well, actually, as you know, so that's the very interesting history on the eve of Mao's death. Mao actually did not want to get rid of Deng Xiaoping because Deng Xiaoping drove a wedge in the Fourth Front Army, and the Gang of Four had to try over and over again. But at the same time, looking at the evidence, and I was talking to Liz Perry about this, Deng Xiaoping was already trying to undermine Mao's legacy even before he died. He actually started this whole think tank with Deng Liqun, right? So Deng Liqun was in this think tank, coming up with all these ideas that had nothing to do with Maoism. He was desperately trying to rehabilitate a lot of the revolutionary veterans that Mao had purged. And then, so the Gang of Four, went to Mao's nephew. He's like, "Whoa, you got to tell your uncle that Deng is trying to seize power," because he was trying to seize power. Actually, it is very clear to me that many of the charges against Deng, right before Mao died, they were true. I mean, he was trying to undermine the revolution. He was trying to seize power. So Mao kind of had no choice but to purge him. From a purely political perspective, Deng served his purpose. He controlled the Fourth Front Army to make sure there's no military challenge. On the civilian side, there was still the Gang of Four in charge, Hua Guofeng, to balance against Deng. And so as long as Deng didn't behave so ambitiously, I think he would have stayed on in the Politburo through Mao's death. But because Deng knew that immediately after Mao died, there would be a political vacuum, so you have to, kind of jump the gun and start seizing power, that became too obvious. So Mao had no choice but to purge him. I tend to believe that for dictators, they don't have a lot of post-mortem policy preferences, in the sense that, while they're alive, they want their policies to be implemented. After they die, I don't think they care that much. Clearly by rehabilitating someone like Deng, you kind of knew that after you die, things are not going to be completely the same, but then at the same time, it's like, well, you're dead. You're a dialectic materialist, what do you care? So, I know, that's my cynical take. No, but because in the book also, Marty, all these Red Guards who were very gung-ho about Mao's ideology, they were treated so badly. Some of these Wang Li and people like that put in jail for life, and they actually didn't do anything that wrong. They helped Lin Biao kind of unwittingly when Lin Biao was getting ambitious. Mao totally could have forgiven these people, put them into, powerful positions. He didn't do that. They all just became kind of cannon fodder in this intense fight between Lin Biao and Chairman Mao. So I don't think Mao was that concerned with this ideological legacy, in my mind. Yes, please.
You make a really strong case for Mao using this coalition of the weak strategy in order to kind of preserve power for himself. We see that there was up until Xi Jinping, a trend of weaker and weaker leaders that came afterwards. Was Deng following a similar coalition of the weak strategy of picking people for these top positions that would not be able to challenge him as well? Or is it
on the civilian side, yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. On the military side, he kept using Fourth Front Army people. And what's very nasty was, in the 1980s, Li Xiannian wrote to Deng, it's like, can you please at least rehabilitate part of our legacy? Can you please, point out that we didn't try to kill, Chairman Mao and the entire Central Committee? And Deng was like, your point is well taken. Your letter to me will be put in the Central Committee archive. That's it. That's like a big, F you, basically. Because he wanted to keep them very tainted, so he could control them, etc., etc. And that strategy, even into Jiang Zemin's era. So the final gift that Deng gave to Jiang was this balance between Zhang Zhen. So I remember this when I was in college, right? So we were talking about, it's oh, why is it Zhang Zhen and they're watching, and there's all these speculations, oh, the two long marchers. It was very deliberate. Why two and not one and not three? Is because one, Zhang Zhen, is from the First Front Army. The other one they were watching from the Fourth Front Army. The two hated each other. They would never side together to go against Jiang Zemin. And that was Deng's gift to Jiang. It's those two are going to balance each other, and even after I die, you can use this wedge between those two to stay in power. And it worked, actually.
So is this primarily about keeping the military
divided
as opposed to dividing the civilian leaders and the targeting government?
Yes, that is a big trick. And Xi Jinping knows this, and he executed a series of purges and promotion according to this dividing the military, and that's a trick. Any other questions? Oh yes, please.
So stepping back, bottom line, what you're basically saying, irrespective of whatever people talk about in terms of the civilian balance of power, actually it doesn't matter. What really matters is balancing the power of the barrel of the gun. Is that a very high level takeaway?
I wouldn't say that civilian politics doesn't matter. It
But
is still
not in the final analysis.
a one-party. Look, I think China, the Chinese Communist Party is institutionalized enough such that the military, even if they want to kind of start some kind of uprising, they can't really do it without an ally in the civilian world. Right? So if you look at what happened to the Gang of Four. So one of the Gang of Four was a military coup. You know, they were arrested by the military. But even for them, they had to find Hua Guofeng, get the Xiannian on board. The civilians had to side with the faction of the military that wanted to arrest the Gang of Four, just like, the civilians have to be on board with the arrest of Zhao Ziyang in the run-up to June 4th. So that's why I think for the dictator, you have to mind both stores, so to speak. You have to make sure that no one can challenge your power in the civilian world, and also the military is nice and divided so that they can get together and make an alliance with some civilian to overthrow you.
Follow up on that? Sure. June 4th, since you mentioned it, the division at that did that have any shadow of first and fourth rivalry?
I haven't done the analysis.
General Shu, which
yeah, I haven't done all the analysis, but I believe people who took part in the June 4th repression did well in terms of getting promotions. But I don't. It's kind of hard to say because some of them were foot soldiers, others were more senior officers. I don't have the data on all the foot soldiers, obviously. So it's kind of. But I think it's two mechanisms. If you participate in June 4th, your probability of you. So basically, in the military, you start as foot soldiers, but some of them get put in the officer track. They start getting all this training and so on and so forth. Once you get an officer track, then it's possible for you to become a general and all this kind of stuff. I think participation in June 4th helps on both steps. Help you get onto the officer track, and also later on help you get promoted.
I meant General Shu, the one who was cashiered.
Which one? Xiangqian.
Yeah, the guy who was cashiered for refusing to.
Oh, the guy who, yeah. He, I'm trying to remember what his background is. He's not one of these Long March veterans. No, he's more junior, from a more junior cohort. Just got cold feet. No, but the Beijing military region as a whole was heavily under the influence of the Fourth Line Army. And so even though this one guy disobeyed, the rest of the military region rolled forward and executed the repression. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming.
Usually we get an update on what happened last week or what happened yesterday, so it's nice to kind of delve deeper into China's recent political history and get an idea that's, I think, for a lot of us, if not counterintuitively, something that we hadn't thought of before. And it shows the benefit of, this is an idea that he's been wrestling with since grad school days. And it often takes a while for ideas to germinate and really make sense after a while. So grateful that you stuck with it for so long and that you shared with us here today.
Thank you.
And don't forget, the discount code is
2022.
There you go. All right. Thank you very much for coming, and look forward to seeing you at future events.